No warrior order in the Imperium is more studied, more emulated, or more quietly resented than the one that calls the realm of Ultramar its home. Their tactics fill the training manuals of 1,000 other chapters. Their founding Primarch authored the very doctrine that binds the Adeptus Astartes together as a coherent fighting force. And yet, for all their discipline and all their victories, they remain a source of quiet debate among those who study the Imperium's military institutions, an order accused by some of rigidity and credited by others with having saved the Imperium from collapse not once, but twice. Their armor bears the same deep blue seen on 10,000 worlds, carried into battle by warriors who trace their lineage to a single source, a single doctrine, and a single extraordinary commander whose influence over the Imperium's military structure has never truly faded. To understand why the Ultramarines occupy this singular position, one must return to their origin, to the world their Primarch built, and to the doctrine that would come to define not only their chapter, but the entire structure of the Adeptus Astartes. The origins of the Ultramarines trace back to the earliest phase of the Great Crusade, when the newly formed Space Marine legions were still finding their identity under commanders appointed in the absence of their genetic fathers. The legion that would become the Ultramarines was designated the 13th, one of 20 such formations created from the Emperor's own genetic material, intended from their inception to eventually be led by a Primarch grown from the same source. For years, the 13th Legion fought without their true commander, distinguishing themselves through disciplined, methodical campaigns that already hinted at the character their future Primarch would bring to full expression. Their conduct during this early period was notably different from many of their sister legions, favoring coordinated, sustainable conquest over the more aggressive or idiosyncratic approaches adopted elsewhere across the Crusade. The Legion's transformation began in earnest with the discovery of their Primarch, Roboute Guilliman, on the temperate world of Macragge. Unlike several of his brothers, whose gestation capsules had delivered them into harsh, war-torn, or hostile environments, Guilliman had been found as an infant by a noble household on a world of relative stability, and had grown to adulthood not through trial by combat alone, but through a childhood shaped by governance, philosophy, and administration alongside martial training. By the time Imperial forces located Macragge, Guilliman had already risen to unify the world's fractured city-states through a combination of military skill and structured statecraft, establishing himself as a ruler whose authority rested as much on competent administration as on strength of arms. This formative experience would prove essential to understanding everything that followed, for Guilliman was not merely a brilliant tactician among his brother Primarchs. He was, from the outset, a builder of institutions, a mind as concerned with the architecture of lasting order as with the immediate business of war.
Upon assuming command of the 13th Legion, Guilliman set about reshaping it according to principles that would ultimately extend far beyond his own command. Where he found capable practice, he refined it into doctrine. Where he found inconsistency, he imposed structure. His legion's officer corps was reorganized around clear, replicable command structures, and its approach to warfare emphasized coordination between infantry, armor, and support elements in a manner designed to be taught, transmitted, and reproduced reliably across any battlefield, rather than relying on the individual brilliance of a single commander. This was, in itself, a quiet revolution. Many of the other legions during this period drew their effectiveness heavily from the singular genius or ferocity of their Primarch, a strength when that Primarch was present and engaged, but a vulnerability whenever circumstances separated a legion from its commander. Guilliman's approach, by contrast, was designed to function with equal effectiveness, whether he stood at the front of the battle line or was engaged in matters 1,000 light-years distant. As the 13th Legion expanded its campaigns outward from Macragge, Guilliman began construction of what would become one of the Imperium's most significant and enduring regional powers, the realm known as Ultramar. Rather than treating conquered systems as distant possessions to be governed loosely from Terra, Guilliman established a cohesive, tightly administered domain encompassing hundreds of worlds across a contiguous stretch of space, bound together by shared infrastructure, coordinated defense, standardized law, and consistent economic policy. Ultramar was, in effect, a working demonstration of what Guilliman believed the wider Imperium could and should become. Not a sprawling collection of loosely connected territories held together primarily through military coercion, but a genuinely integrated civilization capable of sustaining itself, defending itself, and prospering across generations. Macragge itself became the capital of this realm, its fortified strongholds and shipyards transforming the world into both the spiritual and practical heart of the 13th Legion's growing power. Ultramar's success during the Great Crusade was extraordinary by any measure. Its worlds were prosperous, its defenses formidable, and its administrative systems efficient enough that other regions of the Imperium began looking to Ultramar as a model worth emulating. Guilliman's Legion, meanwhile, continued its steady, methodical expansion, compiling a record of successful campaigns that, while perhaps lacking the singular dramatic flair associated with certain other legions, proved remarkably consistent and remarkably difficult to counter. This consistency stemmed directly from Guilliman's growing body of written military doctrine, a comprehensive body of strategic and organizational theory that he continued to refine throughout the Crusade, addressing everything from small unit tactics to the logistics of sustained interstellar campaigning. This body of work, still incomplete during the Crusade's height, would later become the foundation of the single most influential document in the history of the Adeptus Astartes. The relationship between Guilliman and his brother Primarchs during this period was, by most accounts, one of considerable respect, though not without friction. Several of his brothers regarded his methodical, administrative approach to conquest with a degree of skepticism, viewing it as cautious where their own instincts favored decisive, overwhelming force. Guilliman, for his part, rarely engaged in open dispute over these differences, preferring instead to let the sustained success of Ultramar and the 13th Legion serve as evidence for the soundness of his methods. This quiet confidence, some historians argue, masked a deeper conviction that would only become fully apparent once the Great Crusade's unity began to fracture. That an empire built solely upon conquest, without the administrative structures necessary to hold what had been won, was ultimately a fragile empire, regardless of how swiftly its armies advanced. When the Horus Heresy erupted, tearing the Great Crusade apart and turning half its legions against the Emperor, the 13th Legion found itself positioned, both strategically and philosophically, apart from the immediate epicenter of the conflict. Guilliman's disciplined, institution-focused approach to command, along with his demonstrated loyalty and the sheer administrative strength of Ultramar, made the 13th Legion a natural pillar of the Loyalist cause, even as circumstance kept much of the Legion occupied with securing its own extensive territory during the war's early phases, rather than immediately joining the defense of Terra. The 13th Legion's most consequential contribution to the heresy came not during the siege of Terra itself, but in the aftermath of a devastating act of treachery that struck at the very heart of the Loyalist war effort. During a coordinated assault intended to draw Loyalist forces into a trap, the traitor legions, led by Conrad Kurz, Angron, Mortarion, Fulgrim, and Perturabo, inflicted catastrophic losses upon several Loyalist legions gathered for what should have been a decisive counteroffensive. Among those forces devastated in this betrayal, remembered as the Drop Site Massacre, were significant elements of Guilliman's own legion, alongside the Salamanders and Raven Guard, whose losses in the engagement were even more severe. Guilliman, learning of the ambush and the destruction inflicted upon his brothers, moved decisively to consolidate the shattered remnants, extending Ultramar's resources and protection to the survivors of the devastated legions in an act that would have lasting consequences for the structure of the Adeptus Astartes. Even as this crisis unfolded, Guilliman continued a broader effort that would prove, in the long run, at least as consequential as any single battle of the heresy. Recognizing that the war had exposed fundamental structural weaknesses in how the legions were organized, weaknesses rooted in their dependence on individual primarchs whose loyalty, judgment, or psychological stability could not always be relied upon, Guilliman began formalizing the doctrine he had spent decades developing into a single comprehensive text intended to govern the future organization, tactics, and conduct of the Emperor's superhuman soldiers. This document would become known as the Codex Astartes. The heresy's conclusion, achieved at the cost of the Emperor's near destruction and the death or disgrace of Horus and his co-conspirators, left the Imperium in a state of profound institutional crisis. The vast Space Marine legions having demonstrated during the war just how catastrophic it could be when an entire legion's loyalty depended on the character of a single Primarch, were judged too dangerous to preserve in their existing form. It fell to Guilliman, in his new capacity as effective regent of the Imperium during this period of reconstruction, to oversee the implementation of a sweeping reorganization. Every remaining Space Marine legion, with certain limited exceptions, was divided into a multitude of smaller, self-contained formations known as chapters, each numbering roughly 1,000 warriors, each operating under independent command, and each bound by the principles laid out in Guilliman's Codex Astartes. This reorganization, formerly known as the Second Founding, fundamentally reshaped the military structure of the Imperium. No longer would the loyalty or stability of the entire Adeptus Astartes rest upon the character of 20 individual commanders. Instead, hundreds of smaller chapters, each capable of independent operation yet bound by common doctrine, would provide a far more resilient and distributed defense for humanity's worlds. Guilliman's own legion was itself divided during this process. Its descendant chapters, carrying forward the blue and gold heraldry and disciplined traditions of their parent formation across the galaxy, while the original 13th Legion, retained at a larger size than most other successor chapters, in recognition of Ultramar's unique administrative and defensive requirements, continued under Guilliman's direct command as the Ultramarines proper. The Codex Astartes itself stands as perhaps Guilliman's most enduring legacy, a document whose influence extends into virtually every corner of the modern Imperium's military structure. Far more than a simple tactical manual, the Codex addresses the complete organization of a Space Marine chapter, prescribing its command hierarchy, its division into 10 companies each with specialized roles, its standards for recruitment and training, its approach to logistics and supply, and its doctrine for engaging enemies across every conceivable type of battlefield. The document's guiding philosophy emphasizes coordination, flexibility, and sustainability over individual heroism or improvisation, reflecting the same principles Guilliman had applied to his own legion since first assuming command of it centuries earlier. For chapters that adopt its teachings closely, the Codex offers a proven framework capable of producing consistent, reliable battlefield performance across widely varying circumstances and commanders. It is precisely this consistency that has come to define the Ultramarines' reputation, both among their allies and among their critics. Where certain other chapters draw their identity from ferocity, secrecy, unconventional tactics, or singular cultural traditions inherited from their own Primarchs, the Ultramarines have built their identity around discipline itself, around the conviction that victory achieved through sound doctrine, careful coordination, and institutional resilience is more valuable and ultimately more sustainable than victory achieved through individual brilliance or unrestrained aggression. Ultramarine officers are trained extensively in tactical theory and administrative competence alongside combat skill, reflecting Guilliman's own conviction that a chapter's long-term effectiveness depends as much on its capacity for organization as on the martial prowess of its individual warriors. This adherence to doctrine has occasionally drawn criticism from commanders of other chapters who characterize the Ultramarines' approach as inflexible, or accuse them of favoring procedure over the kind of decisive improvisation that unconventional battlefields sometimes demand. Such criticism, however, understates the degree to which the Codex Astartes itself was designed with adaptability in mind. Guilliman's doctrine does not prescribe rigid, unchanging tactics for every situation, but rather a flexible framework of principles intended to be applied with judgment according to circumstance. The perception of inflexibility owes more, perhaps, to the discipline with which the Ultramarines themselves apply this framework than to any actual rigidity within the doctrine, a chapter culture that prizes measured, coordinated response over dramatic individual action, and that regards excessive improvisation as a symptom of poor preparation, rather than a virtue in its own right. The Ultramarines' internal culture reflects this same emphasis on measured competence over spectacle. Recruits are drawn primarily from the population of Macragge and the surrounding worlds of Ultramar, selected not merely for physical resilience, but for temperament. A preference for candidates capable of internalizing discipline, patience, and a sense of collective duty over raw aggression alone. Training within the chapter emphasizes not only combat proficiency, but a broader education in history, strategy, and administration, producing officers capable of governing conquered or liberated worlds competently, in addition to defeating the enemies who threaten them. This dual competence, martial and administrative, distinguishes Ultramarine commanders in a manner that traces directly back to Guilliman's own formative education on Macragge, long before his identity as a Primarch was ever revealed to him. What further distinguishes the Ultramarines from many of their peers is the continued active presence of their Primarch. While the vast majority of the original 20 Primarchs were killed, corrupted, or rendered inactive during or after the Horus Heresy, Guilliman himself, gravely wounded by the traitor Primarch Fulgrim during the war's later stages, was preserved in a state of prolonged stasis for many thousands of years before an extraordinary series of events restored him to active consciousness. His return to the Imperium, occurring after a period of galactic history during which the empire he had helped build had drifted ever further from the organizational clarity of his original vision, placed him once again at the center of imperial affairs, no longer merely as the commander of a single chapter, but as a figure of unmatched authority within the Imperium's highest governing structures. Guilliman's return coincided with, and substantially shaped the response to, one of the most severe crises the Imperium had faced since the Horus Heresy itself: the sudden and catastrophic expansion of warp-based hazards that fractured the galaxy and severed communication and travel between vast stretches of previously connected Imperial territory. Guilliman's immediate response drew directly upon the same institutional instincts that had defined his career during the Great Crusade: the establishment of coordinated defensive structures, the rapid organization of new military formations, and the initiation of sweeping administrative reforms intended to allow the fractured Imperium to function, despite the loss of reliable communication across much of its territory. Under his direction, new Space Marine formations were raised in numbers unseen since the earliest days of the Adeptus Astartes, many of them drawing directly upon Ultramarine doctrine, training methods, and even genetic stock, extending Guilliman's influence across the modern Imperium's military structure in ways that echo, however imperfectly, the scale of his original legion. The Ultramarines' leadership role in the present era extends well beyond their own chapter's battlefield record. Guilliman's position as one of the Imperium's most senior surviving authorities has placed the Ultramarines and their allied successor chapters at the center of coordinated Imperial military strategy across multiple fronts. From the ongoing effort to contain the warp-based hazards unleashed during the recent crisis, to the broader, unending task of defending humanity's worlds against alien threats, internal corruption, and the endless predations of chaos. Ultramar itself, though it has suffered significant losses during recent conflicts, remains among the most heavily fortified and administratively coherent regions under Imperial control, a testament to the durability of the systems Guilliman established millennia earlier. This renewed authority has not been without friction. Guilliman's efforts to reform and modernize aspects of Imperial governance, informed by millennia-old convictions about coordination and institutional resilience, have at times placed him at odds with the entrenched bureaucracies and ancient traditions that had governed the Imperium in his long absence. Many among the Imperium's ruling institutions regard his return with a mixture of reverence and unease, aware that his authority, rooted in his status as a Primarch and his direct historical connection to the Emperor's original design, exceeds that of any other living commander, yet uncertain how fully his vision for a more coordinated, rationally administered Imperium can be reconciled with structures that have calcified over 10,000 years of independent evolution. The Ultramarines themselves, ever loyal to their Primarch's judgment, have found themselves navigating this tension directly, serving simultaneously as Guilliman's most trusted instrument and as a visible symbol of the reforms he seeks to enact across a reluctant and often resistant Imperium. The Ultramarines' place in the broader history of the Adeptus Astartes is, in the end, difficult to overstate. They were not the first legion, nor the most numerous, nor, by the accounts of some, the most naturally gifted in the arts of war. What set them apart, and what continues to set them apart in the present age, was the conviction of their Primarch that lasting strength depended not on the brilliance of any single warrior, however extraordinary, but on the resilience of institutions capable of enduring long after any individual commander was gone. That conviction, tested and validated across the collapse of the Great Crusade, the devastation of the Horus Heresy, and the near collapse of the wider Imperium in the millennia that followed, remains embedded in the doctrine every Space Marine chapter now studies, whether they follow it closely or depart from it by deliberate design. In this sense, the true legacy of the Ultramarines is not confined to Macragge, nor even to Ultramar itself, but extends into the structural foundation of the entire organization the Emperor first envisioned, an inheritance carried forward, consciously or not, by every warrior who now wears the chapter insignia of the Adeptus Astartes.